like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like this old time.
All right, so as you guys are no doubt aware, we've changed our business model at the Jay Burden Show. New big development is the Jay Burden Show premium feed. You still get the same content no matter when or where you watch, but if you want the episodes early and ad-free, you'll have to throw me a few bucks on Patreon, Subscribestar, Substack, or Gumroad. Links down in the description for those. Again, your financial support is not required. You still get the same stuff on the regular free feed, but I really appreciate it if you'd consider throwing me a few dollars. It's how I keep the lights on here. Thank you, and let's get on with the show. All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Very well. Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, so today we are going to wrap up our treatment of Son of Sam and then pivot slightly in the second half. Continues to be very well received. We were talking before about our plans, and very least we've got a couple more episodes planned, right? No definite end in sight. Lots of areas to cover. But where do you want to start, Thomas?
The arrest and arraignment of David Berkowitz and the circumstances of it, those are essential to understanding what is conspiratorial about this case. Okay? And Maury Terry makes much of this, and I think he's correct. I part ways with him on some evidentiary matters. I believe that Berkowitz wrote the Breslin letter. He doesn't. Okay? The Breslin letter was the hello from the gutter letter. Okay? But generally I accept his theory of the case in broad strokes. But the manner in which Berkowitz was arrested and subsequently the way that his arraignment was quite literally stage managed, it was very clear that the police wanted to be done with this case. I'm not suggesting, and Terry didn't suggest, there was some sort of police collusion here. It's the issue is that they were satisfied with considering Berkowitz to be their one good suspect, when really, for the entire year preceding, they'd suggested that, this was a conspiracy of multiple offenders. And New York City was a mess at this time. It's, and the police department was under considerable pressure and a lot of punitive scrutiny. It makes sense. But I believe NYPD and to a lesser degree, the New York district attorney's office was very much duped. And what do I mean by that? Well, the circumstances of Berkowitz's arrest were this. As the first anniversary of the commencement of the .44 caliber shootings, or the Son of Sam murders approached in July 1977, there was a very deep police deployment in the hunting grounds of the Son of Sam, and where there was likely to be another attack. And as we got into, the final victims were Stacy Moskowitz and her male friend Robert Violante. Violante was injured. I think he lost an eye, but Stacy Moskowitz was murdered.
Just an interjection to that point about the police presence. In one of the videos you sent me, which was a bunch of kind of man on the ground interviews, that was one of the interesting details, is describing the police response. And the local residents were unhappy. They're saying this isn't enough. But they were describing, patrolling every block every 15 minutes, right? Going down the kind of like lover's alley where teenagers, pull over to fool around, checking on that, no one's sitting in their car where they can be, attacked. And it was embarrassing for the police, right? Everyone was saying, why haven't you got him yet? And similarly embarrassing for, prosecutors, because even before he was attacked, there was a constant feeling that, he'll plead insanity, right? Or, he won't get the sort of treatment he deserves. And so there was, at least according to the documentary evidence, a lot of anger towards the authorities about these killings. But I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, that's very true. And, this was the era when, like I said, New York City's bond rating had fallen through the basement. The Ford administration had refused to bail them out. The police had laid off, I think, about a quarter or close to a third of their staff out of budgetary necessity. Yeah, there was a lot of bad feeling. And the sense was that the Son of Sam was making a fool of the police. Which wasn't totally unfounded. Also, I might add, and we'll get into what I mean by this, criminal profiling is abject nonsense. Like, I've made the point, this guy, John Douglas, that a lot of people seem to like, that mind hunter nonsense, that man is a charlatan. And the entire science of criminal profiling is nonsense.
I mean, it's phrenology bullshit with a new coat of paint.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It speaks to a sort of managerial attitude towards crime, which is with an appropriate amount of information and sort of an appropriate scientific system. You can use, a logical process to, solve crimes, right? Not merely finding, clues, the facts on the ground, but sort of like a Minority Report-esque profiling.
Yeah,
and,
no, I that's true. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I think there's a place for the psychological and humanistic side of things and analyzing human behavior in predictive capacities included. Okay. But that requires a degree of psychic empathy with your subject. And John Douglas is some goofy cop. If there's anyone who can sort of empathize with people like David Berkowitz or some of these very disturbed serial killers, it's not John Douglas. Let me put it that way. But the profile that they had was that Berkowitz, in some sort of cliched Freudian way, was mad at women, and he had hang-ups about sex. That's why he was throwing shots at people who were making out, as it were. This idea that he was targeting dark-haired women. Well, Stacy Moskowitz had blonde hair. And if you're in New York City, I mean, look, man, a lot of people have dark hair in New York City. You're talking about ethnic people, okay? And
this even came up in that same video you sent me, because obviously the majority of interviews were with men on the street, just kind of normal people, but it featured conversations from law enforcement and from a Brooklynite psychologist, right, who put forward exactly that thesis, right, that this is some sort of symbolic psychological way to strike back at an overbearing mother or something like that.
Everybody's mad at their mom or whatever, or everybody's got hang-ups with some girl who did them dirty. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure that there's it's that banal when you're talking about people who commit horrible sex crimes. I mean, I'm not saying that there's some sort of depth to that beyond something primitively instinctive and psychological. But in the case of the Son of Sam killers, plural, obviously they wanted female victims owing to the symbolic psychological impact of that, and within occult eschatology that has a certain significance, but it was, the rest of it was incidental, but be it as it may, there was deep deployment in what had been identified as the target areas or likely target areas. Stacy Moskowitz and Roger Violante were shot near a city park in Bath Beach. Bath Avenue runs through Brooklyn. For those that don't know, I believe that's basically traditional mafia heartland. It succeeded Pleasant Avenue, I believe. I'm a Chicago guy. Like, New Yorkers will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that to be the case. But be as it may, this is material. This deployment pattern is material to what eventually led to Berkowitz's arrest. Immediately after the shooting, Berkowitz was ID'd. What probably was Berkowitz was ID'd by a couple of different people. This came out later, but what's material is that this local resident, she was walking her dog, lady by the name of Cecilia Davis, and she saw a foot patrolman ticketing some parked cars who were illegally parked. Okay. And specifically, she saw patrol officer Michael Catano ticketing a Ford illegally parked near a fire hydrant. Now this becomes material because after the shooting, the police were continuing of Stacey Moskowitz. They were still coming up short in eyewitness testimony. So they reasoned that, this lady said she saw, a parking ticket being issued. We can identify who in fact was parked locally or was at least in the area around the time of the shooting. Let's pull those names, ID these people, and see if they saw anything. So there was no concept of one of these ticketed vehicles belonged to a probable suspect. But one of those cars ticketed was David Berkowitz's Ford Galaxy. So NYPD calls Yonkers PD, and we touched on this in the previous episode, I believe, just to schedule an interview with David Berkowitz and say, hey, did you see anything, when you were near Bath Beach the night of the shooting? Well, when they call the Yonkers police dispatcher, it's none other than Wheat Carr. And she says, oh, let me tell you about David Berkowitz. He lives behind me, and he's a psycho. He shot my dog, and I think he's a devil worshiper, and he's a dangerous person, so you should investigate him. Now, this is incredibly weird for all kinds of reasons, not just for 6 degrees of separation reasons, but, we mentioned that Wheat Carr was a police buff and a gun buff. And there's nothing wrong with being a gun buff. I'm not saying that's weird. It's not an accident that she was insinuated into the police department as a dispatcher and was always hanging around the cops. And it's not just because she was a badge bunny or because, she was one of these goofs who wanted to be a police. It's very clear to me that she was there to kind of act as a human intelligence asset on behalf of the people she was involved with. Okay. So the NYPD detective is like, well, this is very strange. So the following day after this call, sorry, NYPD, goes to they get Berkowitz's address and they go to investigate his car, make, ID this the right guy or verify it. They go to 35 Pine Street in Yonkers, and the police on the scene noticed a rifle in the back seat, which isn't illegal, or it wasn't at the time in New York. And for a rifle, you didn't even need a permit. You could just with a proper ID that purchase one, and you could carry it with you, in your car or whatever. But this this trip the cops' spidey senses. So they search the car, and you can search a vehicle, with probable cause alone. You don't need a warrant. So the police, Jimmy the Lock, they start rifling through the vehicle. They find a duffel bag, and it's filled with ammo of varying calibers. It's got maps of the crime scenes. And then lo and behold, there's this letter in the glove box addressed to Timothy Dowd, who was a detective on the Son of Sam task force. But the letter, it looked really hastily written. It wasn't carefully written like all preceding letters. It was written in longhand. It wasn't written in any stylized format. There was a plagiarized poem in lieu of original content in it. And the symbol that had been present on the other letters, the Godic circle, with the Mars and Venus sign, it was incorrectly written or copied. It was reversed, and it was it appears as if somebody had tried to draw it from memory and failed to accurately render it. So the police waited on a warrant for the apartment because obviously they didn't want to leave anything to chance. This was the Warren Court era where, the exclusionary rule was very much enforced on Fourth Amendment questions on motion where, there wasn't adequate probable cause or, a warrantless search was effective of a residence, and there weren't immediate exigent circumstances that could be pointed to. So the police, while they were waiting on their warrant, they remained posted up to see if Berkowitz left the apartment, especially because by that point, they strongly suspected him of multiple homicides. So about 10 p.m., Berkowitz left his apartment and he entered his car. And as he got into his Ford Galaxy, a detective, John Falatico, kind of low-key approached the driver's side, drew his weapon, while his backup approached from the other side of the vehicle. And Berkowitz apparently said something to the effect of, "Well, you got me." And he was apparently completely calm, just seemed totally resigned. And Falatigo said, "Well, what do you mean? Who have I got?" And Berkowitz said, "I'm Sam." And then he directed police to a paper bag by the passenger seat floorboards that had his .44 caliber Bulldog in it. And according to some accounts of officers on the scene, he said, how come it took you guys so long? Not in like in a mocking way. Like, you seem genuinely curious, like, why did this take so long? But now this starts getting very weird. When they did finally search the apartment, now, mind you, Berkowitz had a reputation as being this meticulous guy. And he was only by that point a couple years out of the Army. He's in the Army infantry on real deployments to Korea and stuff. The apartment looked as if somebody had deliberately trashed it. There was holes punched in the wall. There was obscenities written in magic marker. Stuff about demons. Stuff about Sam Carr. Just swear words. What I'm getting is it clearly looks as if somebody was trying to stage a scene to appear as if somebody crazy lived there. And for context, on August 4th of 77, so 6 days before Berkowitz was arrested, and before the murder of Stacy Moskowitz, Berkowitz had removed all of his possessions from his apartment, the Pine Street apartment in question, including his bed, his couch, a very nice dinette set, his clothes. He had an expensive Japanese stereo that he picked up when he was in the army that apparently he made a big deal about, showing it off to people. He got rid of that. And his clothing and his furniture, at least, it ended up outside of the big Salvation Army warehouse in Mount Vernon, Westchester County, about 5 miles from his house. And the contents were neatly piled in front of the building sometime in the dead of night to be discovered the next morning. You know, so obviously he was putting his affairs in order. I mean, quite clearly. There was also a series of notes that were strewn about the apartment, written in this kind of deliberately shaky hand, or what appeared to be as such, and the content of them was stuff railing against people in the neighborhood and the New York Police Department and Sam Carter. And it was like the stuff sprawled on the wall, this rambling obscenities and things. This is obviously staged. And in my opinion, Berkowitz all but admitted that later, and we'll get to that. But, as told, and then something, and like I said, the police obviously were under very desperate pressure to identify and arrest a suspect in this case. And I get that, but just the same, this was a very, very improperly handled case. So when Berkowitz was arraigned, they brought him to One Police Plaza, despite the fact that he'd been arrested in Brooklyn. And I don't know New York City police deployment breakdown to their district thing. I think it was 10th District Homicide in Brooklyn. Ordinarily, a murder suspect would have been taken to the criminal court that serves that district. Instead, he was brought to One Police Plaza, clearly to accommodate the media. And there were reporters from, the West Coast, the Midwest, as well as Frankfurt, of then West Germany. There was a Japanese contingent. This was literally world news. The late edition New York Post just had a picture of Berkowitz with the headline, "Caught." Berkowitz, when he was shuttled to One Police Plaza, he was apparently interrogated for all of half an hour. And this man was wanted for 13 shootings, 6 of which were fatal. This would warrant, honestly, weeks of questioning. But it was clear that, again, nobody, not myself or not the late Maury Terry, is suggesting some kind of police complicity or something, but it was obviously a desire to move on from this case, be done with it, and to assign Berkowitz as the sole offender or sole culpable party. People related too, and obviously, I'm sure some of this is people kind of musing after the fact on their feelings, pursuant to subsequent information coming to their awareness. There's a feeling of unreality about the whole thing. It seemed like an anticlimax. I guess is the the right way to describe it. You know, and Berkowitz, despite what he was saying when asked, he didn't seem like an insane person. You know, there's just something not really credible about it. And, you know, but as it were, Berkowitz is arraigned. He was sent for psychiatric evaluation. And while he was, you know, obviously in a high security facility for people deemed criminally insane or, you know, those awaiting trial who are, you know, being availed to a diagnostic regimen to determine their competence or whatever. But while he was there, a loaded .38 caliber pistol was mailed to him at the Central New York Psychiatric Center. Obviously, this was intercepted by, you know, the security there. But it's pretty clear somebody was trying to send him a message. You know, Berkowitz, as he relayed to Terry, he was the designated fall guy. As to why this is, you know, Berkowitz tried to play it off like, well, I'd been seen and, you know, I got a parking ticket. You know, I fucked up. I don't think that's why. You know, I've got my own theory, and I don't want to bore everybody to death with a pedantic explanation beyond what I've already proffered. You know, I believe that, forgive the unintentional pun, he was dog whistle signaling to the authorities in some of these letters. Obviously not all of which he wrote, but the ones I believe he did write. He was surreptitiously trying to identify his co-conspirators to them. He was looking for a way out of this cult mess that he ended up in. You know, I actually think, and I mean, forgive me, this probably seems ridiculous. I just came off of a rant about how criminal profiling is nonsense, and here I'm about to speculate on the psychological state of a criminal suspect. In broad strokes, I believe Berkowitz's personality was somewhat like Timothy McVeigh's. Okay? He was a gutsy guy in some basic way. He'd done well in the military, which was appealing to people who sought to use him. He was very good at taking orders and executing them. And he was self-reliant in the course of executing those orders, but he was not a leader. He was very much a follower. You know, and there was a rudimentary kind of physical and mental toughness to him, but he was not a strong-willed person. He was easily led and misled, you know. And so Berkowitz's claim is I was the designated fall guy. That's why, and he said too, and again, he said the way it was sold to him, he's like, look, I couldn't run because they would have killed my family and I would have been on the run for the rest of my life anyway. And he's like, you know, what would I do? Eventually, they or the police would have caught up with me. But the way that he said it was sold to him was plead insanity. And in those days, this was pre-Hinckley. You could still prevail, and this was the Warren Court era. You know, where a lot of that, I realized that the Burger Court and, you know, later the Rehnquist regime dismantled essentially every aspect of that. But these pre-Hinckley and pre-Reagan, a lot of these precedents were still very much operative and were good law. Okay, just for context, the way Berkowitz says that it was put to him was, you know, plead competent insanity plea, fight the charges based on that affirmative defense. You know, you'll probably do 10 years or something in a psychiatric facility, maybe only 7. And then, you know, you'll be cut loose. And when you get out, we'll take care of you for, basically abiding omerta. And Berkowitz is like, look, I knew that no one was going to take care of me or look out for me when I got out. But he's like, I didn't think I was going to get multiple life sentences either. And I think that tracks. But that's and then over and then over time, Berkowitz has never changed the story. And he's very selective in who he'll talk to. And Terry got this information from Berkowitz over the course really of a decade. It wasn't as if he contacted Berkowitz and said, hey, I'm writing a book. And then Berkowitz, kind of spilled his story, as it were. This was very much curated over many years. And, and also like the things Berkowitz has proffered to substantiate his story, like the Arliss Perry case and the details of it, no one's ever been able to impeach his credibility. I think people have said, well, the story of a cult and this offshoot of the Process Church and this, the Carr brothers, that seems really crazy and far-fetched. Okay, sure, but no one's ever rebutted these things either. He's never been caught lying. So yeah, that's I tend to accept that. I tend to accept the narrative that Maury Terry presents.
Yeah, and it's interesting, even just reading like the lowest common denominator coverage, right? The Wikipedia page on it. It's interesting how much time is spent addressing those allegations, right? Addressing first the idea that Berkowitz, acted alone, and then similarly, the idea that there was both, additional people involved and also some sort of, occult organization. What do you make of the narrative, right, after the case that, Berkowitz was basically crazy. He thought he was getting instructions from, Sam, the neighbor's dog, who told him to kill. Do you put that in the same category as the, magic marker profanities, crazy person kind of Party City props, or do you think there's something to it?
No, there's nothing to it. It was just what I said. And Berkowitz also, not before or subsequent has he ever exhibited signs of mental illness. Actual mental illness. Don't mean, he was in a cult and he killed people. That's crazy. Yeah, he was a very disturbed person. But he was not insane as a matter of law. He didn't have delusions. He didn't see and hear things that weren't there. He certainly didn't think a dog was talking to him. Basically, if Berkowitz was what he claimed to be at his arraignment and beyond, he'd barely be a functioning person. He'd be one of these people who you see babbling on the CTA who can't even keep himself clean. It's like I said, the context here matters. There's literally no way in the present environment, political and judicial, that you will prevail on an insanity plea. It's not going to happen. Okay? This was very viable in 1977. John Hinckley blasted the President of the United States, and he prevailed on an insanity plea. And that changed everything, because the courts, both the federal judiciary and that of the several states, they decided this is never going to happen again. And that's, you see it in the movies too, of the era. I'm obviously a big film genre in the 80s and stuff was, Death Wish type vigilante stuff, like Death Wish, The Star Chamber, The Exterminator, which is a dope movie. I love The Exterminator. But
I think I've seen The Exterminator before. Doesn't he, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't he use a nail gun?
At one part, yeah.
Yeah.
The main weapon's a flamethrower, and Robert Ginty's one of my favorite actors. He's long dead, but if I ever did anything to warrant being famous or notable, I'd want Robert Ginty to play me. But apropos of nothing. But in any event, in all those movies, the subtext, or in some cases, a direct plot device is, oh, this guy did something horrible, but he got off on an insanity defense. And in those days, yeah, I mean, that was silly even then to present it that way, but it was a real thing. You could prevail on an insanity defense. It's an affirmative defense, something that burden shifts to the defendant. He's got to substantiate that by carrying his own evidentiary burden. But people did prevail, including Hinckley. So Burgess wasn't out of his mind and thinking, I can prevail on an insanity plea. I think he was I don't think that was his primary motivation. I think he realized I need a way out of this either because they thought he was gonna rat or blow the lid off of the whole cult, or they thought, or they just or they were genuinely infuriated at the breach of OPSEC, with the sloppiness of him being made by 2 eyewitnesses and then, getting a parking ticket. Or if it was just from jump, they're like, okay, this guy's some soldier boy type. We can convince him to take the fall because he's got no problem being a suicide troop, as it were. Whatever it was. But when it became clear he was going to have to fall on his sword, it was twofold. It was potentially a way out of a life without parole sentence in the penitentiary. And don't make no mistake, like a mental hospital is not much better. In some ways, it's worse. But you do actually have a chance of getting out. And also, too, obviously, it squashed further inquiry into the existence of an in-show conspiracy consisting of multiple persons and co-conspirators and things. So and like I said, I realize I'm somewhat obsessive about this case, but I'm not somebody who, like I said before, I don't insist that where there's smoke, there's fire. Sometimes there's just smoke. But the reason why I do put such a premium on this case is occultism is a real thing. And it's incredible to me because I'll run into people, both guys and girls. They'll be really into Lovecraftian stuff, or they'll like old movies like The Wicker Man, with Edward Woodward, not the ridiculous movie where like Nicolas Cage is like yelling about bees or something.
Infamous for the part where Nicolas Cage in a bear costume runs up and decks a woman.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, you like
3 seconds of film.
Yeah. Nicolas Cage is awesome, and he's like become like a fucking cult movie hero in recent years. But that's a terrible movie. And the original Wicker Man is actually a great film. It's a serious piece. But I'll run into people who understand kind of what Lovecraft or movies like the Woodward movie are getting at, which is that there really is an atavistic impulse in man, even higher races of civilized man. And this is a constant sort of danger of these forms reemerging. And, the old gods, as it were, making themselves known. But then they'll outright reject any suggestion that there remain genuinely pagan and occultic strains in modern life and the collective subconscious. They'll look at me like I'm a crazy person or saying crazy stuff. But the Bergowitz case is a very violent and tragic example of that. And growing up as I did in the 80s, you came to see these things insinuated into all manner of cultural product and symbolic psychological artifacts, prosaic and profound, and it was all around you. So I started thinking when I was kind of old enough to conceptualize such stuff, like what is this? And to be clear, even the reason I sent you that book by Michael Moynihan, Lords of Chaos, there's some sensational stuff in that book, and there's some filler that is kind of typical media pablum. But the kind of core thesis, when he brings it kind of all together, when he says what was happening with these guys, especially in Norway, but in other places too, including the United States, they gravitated to the heavy metal scene because there were, especially when you're talking about the kind of underground fringe of metal, there was this kind of atavistic element to it, and it was very much channeling a certain long dormant but familiar forms, as it were, that would trigger epigenetic memory and things. And that's one of the reasons it was so frightening to people, because in the culture generally, these things were reemerging. Like I said, it was all around you. That's why I object so vociferously to the satanic panic narrative. But to bring it back, my whole point was, you take a country like Norway that is obviously an incredibly advanced society, but in some ways it's kind of insular. And even during the Cold War, the Norwegians, even though they struck out an independent path, they were very much insinuated into the Cold War. It was a very conformist society, but it was also a society that came rather late to Christianization. So especially as, the kind of Cold War started ending, and a lot of these, kind of the ontological shock of globalism started hitting Norway, you had this kind of heavy metal subculture that was drawing a lot of intelligent and kind of introverted young guys to it. And what emerged was a genuine convergence of occultic and pagan tendencies and revolutionary political violence. And that's a very real thing. And I've got a lot of respect for, I don't have a lot of love for Varg himself, but I've got a lot of respect for a lot of the NSBM guys. And I'd like to think of myself as an ecumenical personality in all kinds of ways. I think I bring peoples together. Like, I know I do. Not because I'm like the life of the party, although I think I am kind of fun to drink with and stuff, but
I can confirm after running the experiment a couple times.
But a lot of these, especially the European guys who are into metal and stuff, and especially the political side of art, like I am, the National Socialist guys tend to be very pagan. And I think sometimes they don't, when they approach belief structures with me, I've kind of got to explain to them like my own like confessional heritage and things. And then they kind of get it. They're like, okay, this guy's like redneckish. But I've tried to bridge kind of this chasm between, National Socialist guys who are genuinely pagan, and God-fearing Christians like me. And much of that might seem like oil and water, this is important. It's one of the reasons why I was blessed. R.N. Taylor is a genuine pagan guy. He very much precedes like the NSBM scene and stuff, but he's shown me and the fellows a lot of hospitality. Like, he had us in his house and stuff, but he's just a great guy. But that's one of the reasons I started reaching out to him, isn't just because he had a legendary career as a partisan. But also, I make it a point to kind of try and bridge that gap, because that's an obstacle to, social capital, and we need our people to get beyond that. But the guys where it's a serious mode of life and who've had an experience of a faith awakening as Odinists or whatever, there's plenty of favors who just like take on nonsense because they think it's some edgy thing. I'm talking about guys like Taylor or some of these NSBM guys who I won't name because I don't want to out anybody who's I can't check with first, but they explain it to me as having at first an experience of archetypes and dreams when they're waking life, as they were delving deeper into, their own ancestral heritage, or sometimes just by splendid accident. They started feeling like they were communing, if not with literal gods of old, with, certain psychological, symbolic substrata, that seemed to be coming from somewhere else, be it an epigenetic strain of memory or from some sort of transcendental reality, like beyond our own, and I take that seriously, all that kind of stuff. Okay. I mean, I'm a Christian. So it's qualified in the case of people talking about communing with lesser deities or something, but these people are having a real experience. They're not just being goofy or, huffing paint fumes or something. But, and unfortunately, the Norwegian case, a lot of young guys ended up doing hard time. A lot of people were murdered, and obviously there's nothing positive about that. But when these kind of atavistic strains of cultural psychology and spiritedness, if you want to look at it like that, reemerge, there's often a very violent expression of these things until it can be kind of corralled and rendered into something manageable. So I get it. But, Moynihan's the only guy who was writing about black metal in that sense. And he put into words what was on my mind and kind of captured the essence of it. This was a real thing. It wasn't just kids trying to, make their name ring out so that their record sales would chart. Like, nobody was buying black metal records. Even the guys were fanatic about the scene. Like, what was that? Like 500 guys in the whole country of Norway. So, I mean, it's when people, like, I remember Kerrang, which, I know a lot of people like that magazine. I was never into it. I looked at it as like the edgelord version of Rolling Stone, but, be as it may, like, Kerrang was always talking that kind of shit, as if like, the black metal scene was some sort of calculated marketing effort or something. And I mean, to take it back, this is probably impossible to contemplate these days because things are so different. But for the benefit of the young bloods, like 1992 or 1994, it was totally different, and nobody was doing stuff like that to like get on the charts. Like, that'd be like saying that like Eazy-E was selling crack when he was like first recording demos so that like he could capture clout like on MTV or something. Like, I mean, it's like not
right.
Not reality. Yeah, go ahead.
Like, to your point, in the book that you mentioned, it's incredibly apparent that it was not commercially successful, right? It was this kind of incestuous group where there was not a huge presence in Norway. Obviously, there was a scene around it, but it tended to do better internationally. But all of the records labels were incompetent, right? No one was getting paid. No one could afford studio time. No one was making any money from this. I mean, even, and I can't remember because I just kind of sped through the front half of this book, but even, one of the record shops in, the east side of Oslo, where a lot of this, scene kind of revolved around it. Yeah. Helvet. It was kind of amateur hour, right? Like, it was iconic, right? It was, a place where a lot of, photo shoots for albums were done or guys stayed or whatever. And, people bought and sold records there, but it was a financial disaster.
Yeah.
Right?
No one was making any money. And also, to be clear, like here in Chicago, because there was its own like weird music culture here. I mean, that's why like Wax Trax was such a thing. And like Wax Trax was distinctly Chicago, but it all that like industrial, like goth punk, kind of pastiche. that was huge at Wax Tracks, but they'd also carry a lot of just like weird stuff. And Wax Tracks and this place called Hip Cat Records, the latter was more metal oriented because it was out in Wheeling, and they'd carry like G.G. Allen videos and just like weird stuff that you couldn't find pre-internet. But they'd have like albums by Dark Throne and stuff by like Mayhem and like Emperor. And like that's where I first got turned on to black metal. And I think it was on the back of the I want to say it was on the back of the first Mayhem live album. It said something like pure Aryan black metal, like not a single dollar or kroner or whatever, like will go to a Jewish pocket if you buy this record. And I'm like, that's awesome. Like it's kind of like the brazeness of it. I'm like, what the fuck is this? And so like a friend of mine then turned me on to like some zines that actually covered black metal and things, but it was like nobody, like fringe metalheads knew about it, and guys who were into like the Wax Track scene, who were into like extreme music and into kind of goth type stuff, like they liked it. But even like basically even in those days we were talking about, so that there was a commercial right-wing music scene. It was rocking against communism and like hardcore. Like I was a metalhead and rock and roll guy. I mean, I like REC too, but I was never like big into the punk scene, like a skinhead. And I mean, I gravitated to black metal because it was like right on my alley. And then some years later, like Hendrik Mobus was on the run from the German authorities, and William Pierce put him up at the National Alliance compound, and the Resistance Records guys. And Resistance in the old days was a great zine. They started covering black metal like right before George Birdie went to prison and they went under. I know like Eric Glebe reconstituted the magazine, but he was an idiot and he made it suck. But I'm sorry for the scattershot stuff. I get excited about this topic. But no, go ahead, buddy.
No. I was just reacting. You can keep going.
Okay, yeah. But the point being, like, yeah, this idea that this was just these guys trying to pull trying to pull a flex, like, we're more extreme than the American scene. Like nobody was thinking like that. And really, too, by the very early 90s, Pantera was charting along with alternative bands and like crossover hip hop like Cypress Hill and stuff. But this wasn't 1984 when all this stuff was happening in Norway. It's not like Venom was blowing up and people were like, I'm gonna like outdo these guys, or like, Alice Cooper's shit is fake, I'm gonna like outdo that by making it like nothing. A totally different era, totally different aesthetic, and totally different like artistic.
Well, that was one of the things that I thought was interesting in the book, right? Was talking about how Norway was, relatively speaking, a cultural backwater, right? That they were getting things late. They were getting things sort of absent of cultural context. And Definitely. So a lot of things that were sort of camp in the US and the UK, right, were taken very seriously and taken into a darker direction. Similarly, one of the interesting things, according to this book, and I already know Vingel, longtime Norwegian viewer, is going to chimp at me for these broad statements about Norwegian culture, but you know what, we're going to fire him off anyway. One of the things that book argues is that Norway had been shielded from a lot of horror and violence present in the media in other countries. So the example they used was that, in the 70 years before this book was written, there were 70 movies made in Norway, relatively large, domestic film scene. One of them was a horror movie, 1 out of 70. Similarly, Norwegian culture and the Norwegian government went after horror and violence aggressively, right? Children's cartoons were banned if they had, a gun in it or something like that. And right. So this stuff came out of, like, it was like a bolt from the blue, right? It completely, shattered
No,
the kind of like conservative culture of the era. And to your point about the kind of atavistic nature of it, that comes up when these guys are talking. You know, they're talking about this sort of kind of bland cultural Protestantism of Norway, which obviously, you know, part of a different country, but weirdly enough, you see even guys like, who's the name of that 18th century Danish fellow, Sickness and Death? Damn it, can't remember. Point is, yeah. You see him writing about, you know, the exact same stuff, right?
Yeah.
This kind of cultural Christianity, not in the sense we understand it in America, but, you know, very, you know, kind of conservative, consensus based,
and very
but not
Lutheran
particularly devout.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
No, Norway's actually, I've got huge respect for Norway. I think Norwegians are actually kind of a master race. Like, I'm not just being silly. Like, they're just like an incredible people. And Knut Hamsun is one of my very, very favorite literary figures. And, you know, Quisling, I got into this big argument with this guy who banned me from his Substack because he wrote this hit piece on Quisling. And I'm like, look, man, Quisling was a hero. He was also like an incredibly cultured and humane guy, spoke fluent Russian and like half of other languages, liaised with the Tsar's army, and then later with the Red Army. He married a Russian woman. He was appalled at the brutality of the Soviet regime. You know, that the fact that his name has become mud is really a gross affront to justice. But this guy didn't like that I said those things. But
two things. One, I was talking about Kierkegaard. His name doesn't stick in my head for whatever reason. But one other thing, just as an interjection.
Oh, no.
Hamsun was treated very, very poorly after the war.
Hugely.
Despite being sort of the national writer of Norway, he died a pauper. And it's especially absurd, right? Because at the time of the war, he was 80, right? Or near enough to it.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, what is this old man, right, who literally didn't even live very long past it? You know, he's an octogenarian. Like, what does he have to do with this war? Right? Like, it's absurd.
He eulogized Hitler. That's really what was the nail in his coffin. Oh no,
I know why, but I'm saying the reaction is absurd.
Oh no, 100%. But I've got Norwegians are just like an incredible tribe, man. And so now I found the black metal scene compelling for that reason. But yeah, this is I realize we're coming up on the hour, but yeah, we'll seek into a proper discussion of occultism in music and the atavistic tendency and cultural product and things like that. I mean, it's your show, obviously, but I gleaned from our discussion before it went live that that's where you'd like to go. And I hope this wasn't too scattershot on my end, but yeah.
Oh, not at all, man. This was fascinating. So yeah, as we've said, next episode will be, you know, delving deeper into music. The Chance haven't quite figured out if we're going to do an episode on Crowley first, because he is very much related to, you know, the musical influences we want to talk about. Obviously, Thomas, everyone knows where to find you. Those things are down in the description. Check him out on Substack. One of the best deals on Substack is Thomas's work. You've been doing a great series with friend of the channel, Carl Dahl, on Vietnam. Really been enjoying that a ton. I will also recommend, not on your feed, but recently you did 2 episodes with Pete Quinones about Marxism, which is great because I'm not sure if you're aware, but the classical liberal retard squad has kicked back up again, specifically over the issue of Marx. And it's their contention that Marx was right about literally nothing. And if you say anything about Marx other than this sort of breathless denunciation, then you too are a Marxist, right? It's like retardo John Bircher stuff. So highly recommend both of those. Obviously your website, all of those will be linked in the description. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, get the episodes early and ad free on Patreon. And then you and I have Radio Free Chicago, where we do our current events. The most recent one, because to be honest, not much has happened in America, was kind of continuing our discussions about the UK, and honestly gotten good reactions from that. People seem to really think that's a good episode. So check that out too.
Yeah, no, it's great, man. Thanks so much for hosting me, and thanks for the props.
Of course. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Light can't last forever. Good night.